On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union exploded. Within seconds, steel and concrete were ripped apart, a massive fireball tore into the night sky, and radiation many times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb was unleashed into the atmosphere. For those who stood on the roof of Reactor 3 or raced to the plant as first responders, the consequences were immediate: burning skin, metallic taste in the mouth, vomiting, and, in many cases, death within days. But the disaster was not confined to Pripyat, the nearby workers' town, or even to the Soviet Union itself. The true story of Chernobyl is the story of how one night changed the entire world. The invisible enemy spreads. When the reactor core exploded, it released a deadly cocktail of radioactive isotopes: iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium particles. The graphite fire that burned for 10 days acted like a nuclear chimney, pushing radiation high into the atmosphere. Soviet authorities initially attempted to contain the news, but the radioactive cloud did not respect borders. By April 28th, only 2 days later, radiation alarms in a Swedish nuclear plant began screaming. Workers suspected a local leak, but tests revealed the radiation was coming from the east, from Soviet Ukraine. Soon, radioactive particles were detected across Scandinavia, then throughout Europe, Poland, Germany, Austria, France, and the United Kingdom. Even North America registered faint traces. It was the first time in history that the entire world could track the path of an invisible, man-made disaster carried by the winds. The Soviet Union could no longer hide what had happened. The world knew, and panic began to spread. Abandoned homes, empty cities. The first and most visible consequence was the creation of the exclusion zone. The city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, was evacuated on April 27th, though residents were told it was just for a few days. They left behind their pets, photo albums, and lives, expecting to return. They never did. Within weeks, 135,000 people were permanently resettled. Entire villages in Ukraine and Belarus were bulldozed and buried. Over time, the exclusion zone expanded to a 30-kilometer radius, a scar of land frozen in time, where nature eventually reclaimed the streets, but people could no longer live safely. For the evacuees, the trauma was not only physical, but psychological. Many struggled with poverty, social stigma, and chronic health problems. Some elderly residents, unwilling to abandon the land of their ancestors, returned illegally and lived out their days in ghost villages under the shadow of the ruined reactor. The liquidators, sacrifices for the world to stop the fire and prevent a second explosion that could have destroyed much of Europe, the Soviet Union mobilized over 600,000 people, soldiers, firefighters, miners, engineers, collectively known as the liquidators. They shoveled radioactive debris off rooftops in shifts that lasted only seconds. They dug tunnels beneath the reactor to build cooling systems, often lying in pools of radioactive water. Helicopter pilots flew over the burning core, dropping sand, lead, and boron, even as their instruments failed from the radiation. Many of these men and women suffered severe radiation sickness. Thousands died in the years that followed. Countless more carried invisible scars. Yet their sacrifice prevented an even worse catastrophe. Scientists later estimated that if the molten core had reached the groundwater, it could have poisoned drinking supplies for millions across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Health consequences, a silent legacy. The health consequences of Chernobyl remain controversial, partly due to Soviet secrecy and later political disputes. The immediate death toll in 1986 was officially listed at just 31. But this number hides the far-reaching effects. Thyroid cancer skyrocketed among children in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia due to iodine-131 exposure. Thousands of cases emerged in the decades after the disaster. Birth defects and genetic mutations became a haunting concern, though research remains debated. Families in contaminated zones often lived in fear that their children would carry the invisible burden of radiation. Psychological trauma, depression, alcoholism, anxiety spread among evacuees and survivors, sometimes as damaging as the radiation itself. Cancer and chronic illness were reported at higher rates among liquidators and those in contaminated areas, though exact numbers vary. Internationally, the fear of radiation shaped public consciousness. In countries far from Ukraine, parents kept children indoors, milk was destroyed, and food supplies were monitored for contamination. Chernobyl changed how people thought about invisible threats. Global political consequences. Chernobyl didn't just affect health and the environment, it shook the political order. Inside the Soviet Union, the government's attempt to cover up the accident eroded trust. When Soviet TV finally acknowledged the disaster, citizens were furious. The lies, the delayed evacuation, the lack of information, all became symbols of the system's failure. Historians argue that Chernobyl was a turning point in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The disaster showed the limits of secrecy and control. Mikhail Gorbachev himself later said that Chernobyl, more than anything, was the real cause of the USSR's eventual downfall. Globally, Chernobyl fueled the anti-nuclear movement. Protests erupted across Europe. Countries such as Italy voted to abandon nuclear power altogether. Germany accelerated its plans to phase out reactors. Even decades later, the word Chernobyl remains shorthand for nuclear disaster. Nature's paradox. Ironically, the exclusion zone became an accidental sanctuary for wildlife. With humans gone, forests spread through the ruins of Pripyat. Wolves, lynxes, bison, and even wild horses returned. The land is contaminated, but in the absence of human activity, nature thrived in strange new ways. Scientists study the zone today to understand how radiation affects ecosystems over generations. It is a paradox. The most dangerous place for people became a haven for animals. Yet the soil, water, and plants still carry invisible contamination that may last for thousands of years. Cultural impact. Chernobyl, in memory. The disaster left not only physical scars, but cultural ones. Books, documentaries, films, and the acclaimed HBO miniseries Chernobyl reawakened interest in the tragedy. The haunting images of abandoned apartments, rusting Ferris wheels, and overgrown playgrounds became symbols of human fragility and technological hubris. For people around the world, Chernobyl is no longer just a place on a map. It is a warning, a reminder that technology, when mishandled or hidden behind secrecy, can unleash consequences beyond control. A warning for the future today. Nearly 40 years after the disaster, the ruined reactor is entombed beneath a massive steel sarcophagus, the largest movable structure ever built on Earth. It is designed to contain radiation for 100 years. But what happens after that? Future generations will inherit the responsibility of guarding the site for thousands of years. Chernobyl's legacy is not just in the cancers and abandoned towns, but in the lessons it forced upon humanity. The need for transparency, the danger of arrogance in the face of nature, the reminder that borders cannot contain catastrophe. The invisible particles released that night circled the earth, carried by winds, touching nations that had never heard of Pripyat or the Dnieper River. In that sense, Chernobyl was not just a Soviet disaster. It was a human one. Conclusion. The night of April 26, 1986, ended in fire and silence, but its echoes continue to shape our world. From Sweden to Japan, from Washington to Kiev, governments, scientists, and citizens remember the lesson that one reactor, one mistake, one moment of secrecy can ripple outward to touch millions of lives. Chernobyl is more than history. It is a warning carved into the very soil of Eastern Europe, a ghostly whisper carried on the wind. What happens in one corner of the world can change the destiny of all.